Good morning, colleagues. I guess I'm here to speak about the Syria situation, but by extension, Syria situation is also linked to the Iraq situation. In our humanitarian circles, we call it one situation. The Middle East, and also looking at Syria and Iraq today, is going through a transformation that we have never seen before. In this small region of the world, it's not even a continent, represent 5% of the world population, but represent also 40% of the total displaced people in the world, the 65 million people that's known to us, be it refugees or internally displaced persons, either produced in the region or took refuge in the region. That's a huge number. If we look at Syria, 5 million refugees are in the neighboring countries, and their situation is not really that stable. It's dire due to many reasons. The conflict has gone for so long. Those people have lost their savings. They're going into debts. The international community support as far as funding is also dwindling. A lot of them took what we call secondary movement to Europe and elsewhere. Even after the deal with Turkey, and when that exodus from Syria and surrounding countries abated, the last couple of years with the dwindling funding to the refugees and their needs in the region, the Syrians started to take another secondary movement, this time through Libya. As we speak, there are about 30,000 to 40,000 Syrians in Libya waiting to cross the Mediterranean. Without stabilizing these 5 million refugees in the region, I think we're not going to see peace, we're not going to see stabilization of this population. Inside Syria, we have about 7 million displaced people, but we have another 11 to 12 million people who are in need of international assistance, they're in need of international protection, and they're cut off from livelihood and other services. The war that's raging in Syria is bringing unprecedented destruction, human rights abuses, and the sectors of the population who took in the brunt of this are children and women. If we speak about the battles that are now raging in Deir ez-Zor or Raqqa, let's look at Raqqa very quickly. The 20,000 people that are trapped in the center of the city, used as human shield by the fighters, are mainly women and children. Half of that 20,000 people are children. There are about 10,000 of them. They're held against their will as human shield. They're used as child soldiers. They're used as guard of prisons. They're used as executioners. They're used as suicide bombers. They're used as servants, porters, cooks, and you name it. This is unacceptable in today's world, and the same thing goes on in places like Deir ez-Zor. It happened in Mosul, where we have seen tens of thousands of people are held against their wills. Hundreds of thousands of people fled. 2 months later, they're still squattering in camps, tens of camps around Mosul. They cannot go to their homes for many reasons. There are many obstacles for return. And who's taking the brunt of this? Women and children again. Women have been abused, attacked, and they have been traumatized. This is the first time that we see a huge number of displaced people that have been traumatized. We haven't seen before in recent history. We haven't seen it in Bosnia. We haven't seen it in Kosovo, and in other conflicts. 1 million people are affected because of the atrocities that they have seen or they have experienced themselves. We call for the parties and the local governments to also make all efforts that can be made to make sure that people do go back to their homes and they go back in dignity and safety. There are issues with property. There are issues with documentation to allow people to move from one place to another, to allow people to have access to services, access to justice, and access to assistance. Now, if I look at Iraq, for example, and war is still raging in Tal Afar, in Huwayja, and in other places. What happened in Mosul masked many of the other activities, military activities that are going on in different parts of Iraq. And the situation is the same. People are in need of international assistance, people are in need of international protection, and the most two vulnerable categories of the population are children and women. And that is a repeat now throughout the region. If you look at the conflicts that are erupting in Syria and in Iraq, and the conflicts that now we see in Yemen, where out of 23 million people in Yemen, 20 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance, and the cholera actually is masking a lot of the other suffering and difficult time that people are going through. Children are dying silently because of hunger, for example, of many. And no access to services, no access to employment, to food, and the international community have to also double efforts to really not only find a solution to the conflict and go beyond the logic of war and look at the logic of the humanitarian side of things, the imperative of humanitarianism, because the wars are not going anywhere and we see more suffering. As I said, 40% of the 65 million people that are displaced in the Middle East. And that is also an international security risk and a global security risk in the making now as we speak. I think as we look at Syria, yes, indeed, there are IDPs, internally displaced persons, who are returning. 600,000 people returned since the beginning of the year to specific areas that the government have taken. If we look at eastern Mosul, if we look at places like Homs or the greater Damascus areas and Dara. But that's not enough. That is small. And there are no returnees, refugees, coming from the surrounding countries back into Syria. We have only recorded about 22,000 out of 5 million. And the obstacles for return are very clear: insecurity, destructions, war, lack of services, no access to employment, and generalized violence and insecurity. And also, the areas are contaminated by mines and Oxus, and also 123 armed groups that are still roaming the countryside and still holding territories in many parts of Syria.
Great, thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you for this briefing, too. My question is about the UN involvement in the region. Is there anyone who is listening to the UN? Is the UN given access to any neighborhood, any city that is besieged? Can you update us on that?
Access to population and to areas that are besieged is one of the most important challenges that we are facing, the international community is facing at large. And the power is with those who control these cities, be it the opposition, be it rogue group, be it ISS, and in some instances even being governments. We have been demarching these groups. We have been making some successes in entering some of these besieged areas as interagency convoys, not one agency, but the UN as a whole. And I think our negotiation at times bring dividends. But at times, yes, we fail. We fail the people who are trapped. But it takes two to tango. If you have terrorists and you have hostile groups that are holding hostage against their will, there is no logic. There's a logic of war.
Thank you very much, Edith Lederer from the Associated Press on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Thank you for doing this briefing. On the people trapped in Raqqa, you said about half of the 20,000 were children. Does the UN have any access to Raqqa? I'm just curious to where this estimate comes from. And in terms of the people who are traumatized, what kind of psychosocial services is the UN providing, or are any of the NGOs providing? Thank you.
Valid questions. On Raqqa, we are in the outskirts of Raqqa. We have set up camps, about 52 camps. We received over 200,000 people, and people are still fleeing as the military operation progresses. And we had two messages to the people who are holding, to the fighters who are holding the women and children against their will. That's coward. The ones who are left behind on women and children. Fighters should not hold women and children against their will. Okay, we're calling them to release those hostages, set them free. One, two, we are asking those who are involved in the liberation of Raqqa. It is beyond only a liberation of Raqqa. There is collateral damage, and they have to be very careful and tread carefully because of the populations that are trapped there. As it is, we have seen a lot of death and a lot of victims lost their life. We are not in the center. The estimates come from the people who are coming out. The estimates come from statistics that we know of the city before it has been taken. Those are in the center of the city. We also have experience with that when we look at Mosul. It's a repeat of Mosul. It's a tactic of the ISS, and then the forces that are trying to take over. Now, good question about psychosocial support. And as I said, we haven't seen this before. We're mounting an operation already to take care of the 1 million people that left Mosul and who are traumatized. Now, the repeat of what happened in Mosul, which is now happening in Raqqa, is also happening in Tal Afar and happening in Huwaija, in Kirkuk, in Salah ad-Din, and other places as security forces are clearing the area. We're asking for a coalition of psychosocial support organizations, some of them from the region because of the cultural sensitivities and knowledge, some of them from Iraq itself, some of them from the Middle East because of language and other reasons, some of them from the West where they have other capabilities. And we're bringing this coalition together to do this very tedious, very difficult, and very slow work. And we're talking about big numbers of people. If we estimated about 1 million in Iraq, in central Iraq now, I'm sure of hundreds of thousands of people also in Syria because of what happened. And this is very important work. I think mental disabilities are worse than really physical disabilities.
Thank you. Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. And my question about Deir ez-Zor. And by the way, it's called, just to correct the pronunciation, it's called Raqqa and not Raqqa. That's, common mispronunciation of the city of Raqqa. And now Deir ez-Zor, the battle has started on Sunday. And the Syrian army, the news says that had connected with the besieged 137 division inside Deir ez-Zor. And there are 65,000 civilians trapped in Deir ez-Zor. Now, WFP used to drop from the air some food supplies. Now, what is the situation now as the battle is raging in Deir ez-Zor? Thank you.
The situation in Deir ez-Zor is no different than what we have seen in Mosul before, what we have seen in Raqqa, as you said, is the same tactics. We're using Stone Age military tactics. They besiege the population. They use them as hostage. They do not allow food, water, and other supplies to come in, and they use them for themselves. The situation in Deir ez-Zor is dire, as it is in Raqqa, and as it is in Tal Afar and Huwaija and other places. We entered a new type of war that we haven't seen before. I just referred to the wars of the 90s with the collapse of the former Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. We have seen the Rwanda and Burundi, but I have never seen, and history will record, anything like this.
James? You've mentioned all the different parties that are operating in Iraq and Syria. I'd like for this question to focus on two of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, Russia and the US-led coalition. The US-led coalition criticized by the Commission of Inquiry today in its report from Geneva. Could you just address their activities in Iraq and Syria and the impact on the humanitarian situation? What would you like those two countries to do right now?
Well, I will stick to the humanitarian track and the impact of that. The impact of any war by air or ground war, of course, there's always consequences for humanitarians. I think there was an imperative to take these towns and free the people and liberate these cities from rogue groups. It's inevitable that the logic of war that there will be some collateral damage. What we are calling for is beyond the liberation of these places, there ought to be a way to really care for the population that is trapped there first and trade carefully to make sure that there is minimum civilian casualties, a civilian impact on civilians that are trapped. I know it's a difficult undertaking, but we're calling for all parties to, and especially the fighters on the ground, to take extreme measures.
Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access.
Known to me, Matthew.
All right. Thanks a lot. I wanted to ask you about, I've seen, it seemed counterintuitive to me, but that there are refugees going into Syria currently. There was a quote by, I guess, the UNHCR spokesman, Firas Al-Khatib, that people are going in from South Sudan, Somalia. Can you kind of confirm and how this process takes place and what it says about how bad it is where they may be coming from? My second question is, you mentioned Libya, and I just wanted to know, as UNHCR, are you these reports of some European countries, but in particular Italy, paying money to the government to be distributed to militias to keep refugees or migrants from trying to flee the country into southern Europe, or particularly into Italy? Is it something that the UN is looking into? Would that be a violation of kind of migrant law? Are there battalions in particular towns on the coast getting paid by the government to imprison prospective refugees?
Well, valid questions. Yes, people are going into Syria, Matthew. We have Iraqis now, about 50,000 of them. We have minorities that are going there. Yes, we have all kind of nationalities inside Syria. If you look at the list of type of refugees we have in our books, in Damascus and our other cities, we have a variety of refugees. And I must say, the government have been adopting an open door policy to receive these refugees, and they have not been refoulement, despite the fact that the war is raging. So that is at least is encouraging us to make that protection of those refugees is within reach. Now, on Libya, like you, I've heard news of militias and migrants and liberating some of them from barbaric traffickers and smugglers, and there's some held against their will in detention centers. But beyond that, we did not, these are areas that we don't reach, and we did not come in contact with them, nor we are privy to any deals that are made by European countries and these groups. But there is a mission in Libya, and I think that is their political track and other track that they can look into these matters more maybe thoroughly, that they have presence and they have a mandate to look at that.
Just one follow-up. I mean, if as UNHCR you were to ask a donor country like Italy to disclose to you their other contributions that impact on the right to seek asylum or to flee war, do you think, should they answer you? Would they answer you? And if not, if so, why have you asked? Or if
the free world is answerable. Right. They have to answer, and we are engaged with the Italian government and many Europeans actually on the Mediterranean, on the central Mediterranean issues, because it is a disaster in the making. We have 150,000 to 200,000 crossing. There are reasons why those people are crossing, and I think the reasons for why they're crossing are within reach. There are root causes. There is a conveyor belt that goes from Central and Western Africa up to Libya, but the solution is not in Libya. The solution is answering to the question of poverty, wars, and the business model of smugglers and traffickers. There is a need for an international law enforcement mechanism that curtail these trades. If I tell you that, Matthew, between January and now, 100,000 people crossed over to Yemen. And I just described Yemen. War, airstrikes, poverty, no health system, cholera outbreak, no livelihood. 100,000 people were lured into Yemen from Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia. The business model and the money that the traffickers and smugglers are making need to be tackled by the international community and need to be a priority, because lives are also lost in the process.
Mr. Awad, it's Pamela Falk from CBS News. We've spoken before. The question of, I'd like to follow up on Edie's question about these 10,000 children that are being used as executioners, human shields, child soldiers. You said you've called for the international community when they are extracted and they're in the outskirts and refugee camps to help. Has UNICEF or any other agency been able to deal specifically with these children in terms of the counseling that Edie was asking about?
Yes, indeed. The interagency UN mechanism kicks in, and that is how, out of Damascus and other towns, the UN is ferrying goods and relief and doing counseling to these refugees, these IDPs, internally displaced persons, as they leave Raqqa, as corridors are open for people to flee. And we're meeting them on the front line with all services that we can deliver. But I think the issue of psychosocial support is a deeper, bigger, technical, difficult, tedious, and slow. And we're calling for a coalition, and it is in the making, to make very comprehensive, clear programs to deal with the hundreds of thousands of people who are traumatized, women, children, and others, the elderly.
As a follow-up, these 10,000 children are still inside.
They are in the line of fire, covering with the fighters in many of the neighborhoods. They're held hostage.
And do you have any numbers on how many children that were in that situation have left? Like in camps, outside?
I don't, if you take the percentage of children in any population like that, and there is an age of 15, we're talking about 30 to 40% from the age of 0 to 15. So there's a huge number of children in these camps, and they have suffered, they took the brunt of all of that's happening. It's a tragedy of our time.
Thank you. Matthias asked with TV2 Norway. I was wondering, what's been the impact, if any at all, of President Trump's travel ban on the refugee situation in the region?
We have a long-standing cooperation with the United States when it comes to resettlement and when it comes to mobility of refugees. And we select people according to criteria of countries that are receiving refugees, what we call resettlement, legal pathways, scholarships, sponsorship by friends or relatives. And we're still reviewing with the U.S. government. It wasn't a total blackout. It wasn't a total close. We were able to send people, but it has slowed. And it slowed tremendously. I'm hoping that we go back to track and do have the U.S. Receive those that were chosen and selected to go to the U.S., that they have been interviewed and they have been prepared to go to the places that we're supposed to go to. So yes, we have an impact. We had an impact.
Dr. Hamid, and two more questions.
Yes, thank you. As the battle for regaining Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor is underway now, do you expect, sir, a large influx of returning refugees back to Syria? Are you prepared if you see hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees coming back to Syria from Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan?
The conditions for return are not ripe, and they're not there. There are so many obstacles. The massive destruction that you see today in Syria is inhibiting a lot of people in making that decision. The insecurity, as I mentioned earlier, 123 groups roaming the countries. The refugees in the surrounding countries, they're aware of that. And we did our surveys, we did our homework, we're in touch with our population of concern. Our surveys indicate that 82% of them, they say, yes, we will return. But they have conditions. One is security, physical security. Two, services and livelihood. 10% of those said we're not decided. 6% said we will go even now if we find safe places to go to. So we have our fingers on the pulse. We're talking to our population of concern, and we're looking at ways to also support them wherever they are now until conditions are conducive for return. We're not promoting return. We're not facilitating it. We'll be sending people to the killing fields, but we will accompany returns, spontaneous or self-organized when it takes place. It's a different situation for the internally displaced persons. As I mentioned, there are 600,000 of them return. But those people are in close proximity to their homes, and they're able to assess the situation for themselves and make that decision to return.
Last question.
Mr. Awad, Kahraman Halis Çelik with TRT Turkish Radio Television. Now I have a question in follow-up to James' question on the civilian casualties that are happening in and around Raqqa. The Syrian Democratic Forces and the U.S., the country that is helping them, we hear a lot of reports saying that there are a lot of casualties, civilian casualties. Do you have any numbers on those? Do you have number of those who are misplaced? We also see some ethnic kind of ethnicity exchanges, people moving into places where they do not belong to. People are moving out of their villages. Can you update us on that? Thank you.
It's a very chaotic situation. Since the beginning of the year until now, talking about the issue of displacement, 1.3 million people were displaced. That is, if you count the calendar days in a meticulous manner, that's 7,300 persons a day that are moving. While we see some pockets because of the de-escalation in southwestern Syria and Homs, for example, stabilized, and we see people went there, there is a huge, massive movement because of Raqqa, because of Deir ez-Zor, and because of other points. It's very difficult for us to really assess how many people came out of a specific city because of, and how many people killed because of military activities. Because in this situation, we cannot tell, are the fighters in the ground also killing people? Is it the coalitions from outside, or is it the oppositions or the other fighters? And mind you, there are many groups now converged in fighting the groups that are holding Deir ez-Zor or Raqqa or other places. So it's really a chaotic situation for anybody to take account of anything. But we have to renew our calls for people to cease fighting and to take civilians as a first priority. The logic of war to liberate the city, yes, fine, but there are population in that city. What is the use of liberating a city while a big sector of the population going to be dead when we lift the lid to see really what is the aftermath of that?
Great. Thank you very much, Amin. Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you very much.
The figure you just gave us there, the 1.3 million and 7,300 a day, is that Iraq and Syria? What is the
That is Syria proper.
Just Syria?
Just Syria.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.